Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Facebook Live class for Woodland owners on our Learn About Your Land Facebook page. My name is Bill Clace. I'm a natural resources educator with UW-Madison Division of Extension. And tonight, we will be talking about some reasons why you may need to cut timber from your woodland. We will also have our handy tip of the week and our tree of the week. Now, you can pose questions to us during the broadcast by entering them as a comment in the Facebook Live post, or send them to me via email at learnaboutyourland, all one word, @gmail.com. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn over to Cody. Why don't you introduce yourself and get started?
Yeah, let's get this. Real quick, Bill, you've disabled participant screen sharing,
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
I can't share my presentation.
It was going so well.
Get off to a great start. So my name is Cody Didier. I'm a DNR forester based out of our Fitchburg office. I spend half my time working on public lands, managing state-owned forests, and half my time working with private landowners, helping them manage their woods. I cover all of Lafayette County, all of Greene County, and the west half of Dane County. Okay. So welcome you all to my online class right now. It's only fitting that all the other schools and colleges have gone online. So we're at Timber Harvesting 101 before you cut to the chase. Again, obviously we're part of the Learn About Your Land series here. What I'm going to be talking to you about today are some reasons why you might need to or want to cut timber on your property. So with that, we'll get started. So first I want to get started with my favorite quote from Aldo Leopold. A conservationist is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature on the face of the land. Obviously, when he says stroke, he's talking about the stroke of an axe. This is from his Axe in Hand essay in the Sand County Almanac. In that essay, he's talking a lot about what's going through his head, his own personal biases when he's choosing which trees to cut and which trees to leave on his own property. Now, Aldo refers to it as a bias in his essay, his bias for cutting trees, or not cutting trees for that matter. But what that really means is his values and his goals for cutting trees. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. The reasons why you might want to be cutting trees are directly related to your values and your objectives for your own property. So there's three things I want to convey today. One, help you understand these reasons why cutting timber might be appropriate on your property. Two, help you kind of contextualize how timber cutting might be appropriate on property, but also with the constraints of what your forest looks like and what timber operations can do. And then three, where you can go to find some help to take next steps if what I'm talking about today is of interest to you. So first we'll start with the big picture. This is kind of the grand scheme of things, you know, the overall arching reason why across the whole state of Wisconsin, why cutting timber is important. So first, the forest industry is a huge economic driver in Wisconsin. Forest products sector is one of the top industries in the state, over 64,000 jobs and over $24.7 billion in annual output. As Wisconsinites, we can be really proud of the fact that Wisconsin leads the nation both in paper production and in wood furniture manufacturing. And in many states across the county, or many counties across the state rather, forestry is one of the top employers and is also one of the top economic producers. So the next thing is private land ownership in Wisconsin. Land ownership has a huge impact on how forests are managed and what sort of timber cutting happens. In Wisconsin, over 2/3 of the forested lands are in private land ownership. I think of that, it's a little under 60% or so, I believe, is in family forest ownership. Now, within that private land ownership, we know there's some trends happening. First, the average parcel size is decreasing. In the last statistics I saw, I think the average parcel size was 26 acres. And then the number of owners, individual parcel owners, is increasing. So you have smaller parcels and more owners out there. Another thing we know through the National Woodland Owner Survey is that timber management's pretty far down the list, far near the bottom of the list of reasons why people own woods. Out there in the landscape in Wisconsin, you have most of the woods controlled by private landowners. Lots of landowners, small parcels, and probably very little knowledge or little interest in forest management, and most definitely a wide value set on why they own woods and how they might manage their woods if they choose to do so. Again, on the landscape level in Wisconsin, through forest inventory data, we know that aggregate all the forest, all the volume growth in a year exceeds removals in a year through timber harvesting and mortality. Now that's across all timber lumped together. Individual forest types, it's going to be a different story, but just kind of goes to show you that cutting timber is not going to create the disappearance of forest. And in fact, there's more acres of forest that return to forest each year than are converted to non-forest uses. The last point to make here is that timber harvesting really does the heavy lifting for us. This is like the single most useful, economically viable tool we have to do forest management on a landscape level. And so when I'm talking about timber harvesting, timber cutting, what I'm talking about is practicing active forest management, literally taking action to manage the woods by cutting trees and doing manipulation of the vegetation. I'm going to contrast that against passive forest management, in which you just kind of let nature do things and let the forest evolve as it will. I make an argument that active management is extremely important and probably more important than ever because the forests of today are facing unprecedented threats. If you think about climate change, over the course of the next 80 years towards the end of this century, and even right now, forests are facing conditions that they didn't grow up in, and it's only going to become more severe for trees. Then we have invasive species that are competing with our trees. We have insect and disease issues like emerald ash borer and oak wilt. And then you could also envision the compounding factors of, you have trees that are subjected to stress through extreme climate events that are less able to fend off insect and diseases that they might normally be resistant to. So there's a lot of threats out there. So we know that practicing active forest management, doing timber cutting that's beneficial for the woods, can help forests be resilient in the face of all of these threats. I also want everyone watching today to understand that cutting timber is a means to an end. I was talking about Aldo Leopold's biases for cutting timber. He's cutting timber to achieve objectives on his property. And that's why you can look at harvesting timber as a way to achieve what you want to see happen on your property. So obviously, cutting trees is one important goal for cutting trees is managing forests. Everything we're going to talk about from here on out are different reasons why we want to manage forests, and cutting timber helps us manage our forests. So there's two types of cutting. There's cutting that's going to improve the existing forest. We call that thinning as foresters. There's cutting that's going to make way for new trees. We call that regenerating the forest, growing a new forest. That thinning can either be a commercial thinning or a non-commercial thinning, depending on what kind of trees you have and volume, size, markets, etc. But the thinning, the idea is to reduce the density of the forest to improve the growth in the trees that remain, improve the health of those trees by reducing the competitive stress, and taking out trees that aren't going to compete well and capturing the value of those trees that might die before you do another harvest in the woods. So be targeting at-risk trees, undesirable trees like ironwood or box elder, poor quality trees, and trees that are competing with your best trees to help your best trees grow fast and remain healthy. Another advantage of that thinning, improving the forest, increases economic yields. By capturing that value, you're growing larger trees faster, and by selecting out poorer quality trees, you're coming to do a timber harvest when the trees are mature. You're going to improve the final product of those trees and the quality of that harvest. So regenerating is a broad spectrum. It can go from cutting individual trees across a stand, or you could be cutting the entire stand of trees. And when I say stand, that's just forester jargon for an area of woods that's roughly the same. It's the same kind of woods. And so those small scale disturbances, a tree here, a tree there, is going to favor shade tolerant trees over the long run. And the large scale disturbance is going to favor shade intolerant trees over the long run. And we'll see what the implications of that are when we talk about cutting trees to improve wildlife habitat. So what I've come up with here are what I think are some pretty good reasons to cut timber. Income, obviously, maintain a healthy forest, specific forest health concerns, wildlife habitat, salvage, firewood, and recreation. I talked about that National Woodland Owners Survey, and you can see this is kind of what it looks like in Wisconsin, that timber highlighted in blue is all the way at the bottom of that list practically. And you can see there's a number of other different values in that list. And I would think that those values roughly translate to different reasons that I've laid out on the list on the left. Some of those objectives I laid out on the left will probably capture multiple values for a lot of landowners. One thing to keep in mind is that you can achieve multiple objectives with a single timber cut, and you can maintain a healthy forest and grow wildlife habitat. But one thing to keep in mind is that in some cases, maximizing one value can make it harder to achieve other objectives or decrease your ability to achieve those objectives. For example, in that list of values there for the National Woodland Owner Survey, you can see that beauty is very high on the list. So aesthetics is something that we're always considering in timber harvesting. If you're managing a timber cut to maximize or minimize rather the aesthetic impact, you might have a harder time achieving wildlife habitat goals that involve creating openings to get shade intolerant species or create openings for brushier, more open wildlife habitat. So I'm going to talk about each one of those objectives or goals or reasons in a little more detail here. So first I say income, obviously, as a question, because I'm kind of surprised the number of times where when I'm talking with the landowner, I'll be discussing different ways they can cut timber and how the timber cutting is going to improve their woods and how it's going to help them achieve their objectives. And then at the end of that discussion, they'll say, well, so am I going to have to pay someone to cut these trees for me? In a lot of cases, what I'm talking about is commercial timber harvesting. Obviously, there are some cases of non-commercial cutting, but usually it's smaller scale projects. But people, for a lot of timber harvesting, they'll pay you for that wood. Another example, I met with a fella, he's owned the property for 30 plus years, I believe, never paid attention to the woods. And one day someone knocks on his door, offering him a bunch of money for his trees. He had the wherewithal to call me because he'd never had someone offer him a bunch of money for his trees before. We looked at it and he had a bunch of walnut. And he was just flabbergasted by this amazing walnut resource he had that he was completely unaware of. And he was really excited about the potential to manage his forest and initiate forest management after 30 years of owning the property, knowing that he has that valuable resource there because it was an investment property for him. Another reason where income comes into play is that when you're doing timber harvesting, depending on the woods you have and the quality of the woods and forest type, you could potentially have periodic income through harvest, every 8 to 12 years or so. And then lastly, if the timber cutting is well done, the goal is to improve the overall quality of the woods, whether it's a improvement cut or a regeneration cut. And when it's done well, you can really improve that chunk of land as a whole. So if you own that property as an investment, the value of investment increases to doing that sustainable forestry and that sound forest management through cutting timber. There are 3 scenarios though where income is not a good reason. These are 3 types of cutting that maximize short-term gain, but they're practicing really poor forestry and degrading the overall resource. That's high grading, diameter limit cutting, and doing economic clear cutting. So a high grade is essentially taking out the most valuable trees in a woodlot, and while that can have a minimal impact to the aesthetics of the woods, by taking out all those really premium trees, you're degrading the overall value of the wood, making it harder to manage that woods going forward, and giving you less growing stock to continue to manage that forest. A diameter limit cut is, for example, taking every tree greater than 18 inches. You could potentially be cutting a lot of your really good trees that have not reached their full potential yet by doing so. And lastly, an economic clear cut is taking out whatever the cutter believes to be merchantable trees without any thought towards what the outcome of that harvest is, how we're going to regenerate the woods, what the future of that forest will be. So the next reason to cut timber would be maintaining a healthy forest. And this is probably one of the most common things I hear from landowners when I talk to them and ask them, what they want to do with their property. Why do they give me a call? What are they looking for? want to maintain a healthy forest. So timber cutting is valuable for maintaining a healthy forest because as trees grow up, the forest becomes denser and denser. That competition increases as the forest density increases, and stiff competition for resources causes stressed trees, and stressed trees are less healthy trees. So you can do cutting to improve the woods, pick out some of the competition, focus the growth in your best trees, give them more room to grow, and less competition allows these trees to maintain good health and good vigor long term. Especially when you're thinking long term, a lot of trees can grow for a very long time. White oak, for example, can live really long. But if the forest isn't managed and trees are going through a lot of stress, they lose their ability to grow into old age. So by doing periodic thinning, allowing these trees to continually have good health and good vigor, you can potentially grow larger trees and hold them to an older age class as well, on appropriate sites, of course. And one other way to maintain a healthy forest through cutting trees is by thinning in pines. So pines can be susceptible to wildfires. So by doing thinning in pine, you can cut out trees before they become dead standing trees, and you can also reduce the fuel load and the potential for fire to climb the pine trees and get into crown fire, for example. In addition to, in general, maintaining a healthy forest, there's specific forest health concerns that can be addressed through cutting trees. For example, you can remove ash trees and elm trees, which are susceptible to emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease, respectively. As foresters, we tend not to manage for those because of those insect and disease concerns limit our ability to rely on those trees long term. In addition, if you look in the picture here, you can see a couple pockets of dead trees. Those are oak wilt pockets, and you can use timber cutting in conjunction with either root grafting or herbicide treatments to get on top of oak wilt pockets, try and contain those pockets, keep them from spreading to the rest of your oak woods, and also salvage the value of some of that oak timber. So wildlife habitat is probably the second biggest reason I hear from landowners on why they're interested in cutting timber, working with the forester. A lot of our species that we like use forest, deer, turkey, neotropical migrant songbirds. And what animals and wildlife are looking for in the forest is basically food and cover. They're looking for water too, but food and cover are the two things that we can manipulate the most through managing our forests. And so what we can do is cutting timber and forestry practices, provide mast. We're looking at acorns, walnuts, hickory nuts, berries, cherry, or potentially opening up the canopy to get more sunlight to the ground to produce a flush of forbs and other things that wildlife can forage on. And a really important reason to cut timber for wildlife habitat is to manage for oak. Particularly in southern Wisconsin, oak is kind of disappearing very slowly. It's not quite following that growth is exceeding removals trend that we see on the landscape level across the state, across all timber types. Because oak is very difficult to regenerate right now because it needs a lot of disturbance. Not a lot of landowners are willing to do the heavy cutting necessary to get oak, and it's being replaced by more shade-tolerant species that are less valued for wildlife. So if you have the opportunity to manage for oak, it should be a consideration to help you manage for wildlife. You can also do timber cutting to create openings. If you have old mature woods with very little understory, by doing some patches of heavier cutting, getting a lot of disturbance, a lot of open area, you can create a lot of young forest habitat and a lot of brushiness that wildlife will use a lot for cover. And also you can create some edge too, and those edge habitats are also very important for a number of different species. And also when we're doing timber harvesting, we can make sure to leave snags or create snags, snags being standing dead trees. You can leave big open grown type legacy trees, wildlife trees, and also by doing the timber cutting, some of those tops and trees that might not get utilized would be valuable, of course, woody debris, which is great for wildlife as well. Salvage is obviously a great reason to cut timber. With salvage, you're essentially making the most of a bad situation. I've been through a couple of small scale blowdown incidents myself in Southwest Wisconsin, 2014, 2015, and very recently in a lot of people's minds is last summer up in northern Wisconsin, they had a very significant blowdown event. And what you're doing through salvaging timber, you're harvesting to capture some of the value. Obviously, it's not going to be as valuable as it was where it's still standing timber, but probably more importantly for a lot of folks is they're going to clean up the mess. You know, if you're unable to use salvaging or you're unwilling to do salvage timber harvesting and clean up the mess, it's going to be extremely hard to manage that forest long term going down the road because that mess is not going to get any cleaner over time. Trees will degrade and decompose. That could potentially be a very messy situation for a very long time without doing salvage harvesting. A lot of landowners, they cut firewood off their property, and that's a great way to accomplish good forest management on a small scale. There's a number of undesirable species that almost across the board when I walk into a woodlot, I encourage landowners to knock out these species to favor more beneficial species. And species like ironwood, elm, ash, bitternut, hickory, black locust, they're all really great firewood trees as well. They can put out a lot of BTUs. You can also use firewood cutting to clean up after timber harvest, or to also address maybe some small scale storm damage events. The last one I want to touch on is recreation. So you can see in that picture there, there's some trails in there, and those trails are skid trails that are created from timber harvest. And I've actually worked with a couple landowners that, while they weren't super interested in managing timber for economic returns or timber harvesting or timber production, they were very interested in how that kind of operation can create trails for them on their property. So they went through with some timber harvests to create the trails that they use for their recreational purposes. So a couple more things I want to talk about here. So this is where the rubber meets the road. So we just talked about a lot of really good reasons and goals that landowners might have for cutting timber, but not all timber cutting is appropriate in all forests. There's kind of two different things we got to think about for what's appropriate timber cutting: the condition of the forest, and then the different challenges and constraints that site presents. So depending on the species, age, stocking, volume, quality, health, site potential is really important. Presence of seedlings and saplings and invasive species, those are all going to factor into the different kind of forest management you can do by what that forest is giving you. If you have very few oak trees and lots of maple trees, it might be very hard to go to practice oak management long-term on that property. And also there's a lot of challenges. So we talked about the small parcel sizes that are happening or that landowners have. On small parcels, it can be hard to practice forest management, especially commercial timber harvesting, if the species aren't desirable, if the markets aren't present, if there's not a lot of volume available through the timber harvesting on the small parcel, depending on the type of forest management timber cutting that a landowner is interested in doing or willing to do. And then type of non-commercial work that might be needed, seasonal restrictions, water, crossings, best management practices, topography, equipment aesthetics are all different challenges that can kind of dictate what sort of timber harvesting is feasible and appropriate on your property. And so that's a lot to keep track of. I mean, not all landowners, most landowners aren't going to really know what to make of the different forest condition elements and the different challenges. So that's why it's really important to work with a forester to sort out how to put that all together. So what you want to do, across the board, even if you're not considering timber cutting, if you're just looking at ways to improve your woods or to set up a game plan altogether, you want to have a plan for your woods. And if you don't have a plan, you should plan to get a plan. There's financial aid available to landowners who are interested in getting forest management plans. And you want to have a plan that's more specific for the timber harvest. You want to have a plan for any sort of work that needs to be done before or after the timber harvest to make that cut more successful. Things that I'm talking about there are invasive species control or cutting non-commercial trees that might interfere with growing new desirable trees like oak that you want to grow. I encourage everyone that's watching this, that's interested in this, to work with a DNR forester. It's half my time I spend working with landowners. I'm a free resource to landowners, forest landowners. I can give you free advice, recommendations, listen to you about what you want to see happen to your property, and lay out all sorts of different options for you as far as managing your woods and doing timber cutting. And if you're interested in doing commercial timber harvesting, across the board, I encourage you to hire a private consulting forester. By hiring a private consulting forester, you're going to have a professional who's working for you. He's going to work with you to address your goals, meet your goals through that commercial timber harvest. And that forester will help you maximize both the economic return on that timber harvest through a competitive bid process. And he'll also help you maximize the forest management that you're going to achieve on that timber harvest. You can see on the bottom there, if you go to dnr.wi.gov and search keyword forestry assistance locator, you'll find a directory where you can find both your DNR forester for your county and also a list of private consulting foresters that work in your county. So that's all I have, Bill. I'll turn it back over to you then.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. First one is, how do I attract more turkeys to my property?
So to attract more turkeys to your property, what I talked about earlier is you're looking at food and you're looking at cover. So if you can manage for oak's a great way to attract turkeys to your property. They love oak woods, oak hickory woods. You can also try and have a diversity of habitat covers on your woods. So if you can have some edge, have some open area, have some more mature forest to give them some cover, give them some open area. If you can create openings where toms can strut around, have some brood habitat too in the edges there with a little brushiness, those are all different ways you can manage your forest to try and get more turkey.
Okay, here's another one. People have told me I need to cut some trees because they are too crowded. How do you know if that is so?
Yeah, so if you're concerned about crowding your woods or someone's told you that, definitely give your DNR forester a call. We will come out and assess that situation. I get that call fairly often, especially in kind of these pine hardwood plantations, and a lot of times they're not as crowded as people think they are, especially if you're looking at a pine plantation where those trees, if you think of the elementary school drawing, you got that triangle shape tree, and your deciduous trees, you got the lollipop. So the hardwoods and those conifers, they're kind of occupying different canopy spaces up there. So a lot of times they're not competing with each other as stiffly as people think they are if they're looking at it from eye level.
Okay. How do I know if the logger is cutting more than they should?
So if you're having a commercial timber harvest, I strongly recommend you have a private consulting forester involved. One thing we do with timber harvests is we have what we call a stump mark on the tree. So when we're out in the woods and we see trees that were cut that don't have a stump mark, those are potentially trees that were cut that the logger shouldn't have been cutting. Another way to know if they're taking more or cutting trees they shouldn't be cutting is just be really familiar with your woods, kind of have an idea of the trees that were marked and what trees you have out there too.
And great, okay, and kind of along the same lines, where can I find a logger that I can trust?
You can find a list of loggers if you contact your DNR forester. There's a theme here, right? Most DNR foresters will be able to provide a list of loggers that operate in the county. Obviously, we can't make recommendations or warranty any of the work that those loggers do. But if you, again, the theme here, if you work with a private consulting forester, they can steer you towards loggers that they may or may not like to work with.
Okay. That's all the questions that's all the time we have questions for on that topic. Thanks, Cody. Let's move on to, why don't you stop sharing and then I will share.
Sure.
The handy tip of the week. So our handy tip of the week is to keep your chainsaw sharp and to keep the chain and your chainsaw sharp. And the first part of that tip is to use the right tools. And for every chain, there's a different sized file you need to use to make sure that, to file the cutters. And in this picture is, each one of these is called a cutter. And you need a certain size file, round file if you're filing by hand. You want to make sure you get the right one. And it should say in your owner's manual what's the right size. And if you don't have your owner's manual, then I would go to a distributor of the saw that you have and ask them. Now, when you do sharpen, you want to make sure you hit all of the cutting surfaces on each one of these cutters. And hopefully you can see my mouse. There's the side plate. This is a cutting surface on the side. The point is a cutting surface. And then on the top plate, this angle right here is also a cutting surface. So there's 3 surfaces you need to make sure that are sharp. The top plate angle should be scribed onto the top of the cutter, the right angle for that. So if you just follow that, you should have the H cutter at the right angle. The side plate is kind of a slight hook to it. You don't want that to be too severe. And if you're using the wrong file, often you'll get a very severe hook there and a very pointed point. And that's not the best kind of cutting situation. So if everything's right, it should look like these examples right here in the picture. You also want to make sure that the depth gauge, this piece in front of the cutter, is also filed down when you sharpen the other cutting angles. You might not always need to bring down the depth gauge, but you should have, there's a tool that you can use to make sure the depth gauge is at the right depth. And so whenever you're filing, if you're doing a lot of cutting and a lot of filing, you need to have that tool to make sure that they're also called the rakers are at the right height. And it just takes a flat file and you can file those down pretty easily. Now, some other tips are is to keep an eye on how the saw is working. If you're cutting and it's throwing some chips, that's a good sign. It should be cutting through the logs pretty easily, or the trees, especially if the tree is down and it's on the flat surface and you're cutting down through it. The saw usually, if it's sharp, will pull right through the tree, depending on how hard the wood is. And more often than not, you're just kind of holding onto the saw to make sure it doesn't run away from you. That's a good sign that your saw is running well and it's sharp. But if it's not cutting very fast and it's throwing dust rather than chips, it probably need to stop and run a file over it, get it nice and sharp. Don't ever feel like you should have to push on the saw to get it to work. That's a bad sign. That's a very bad sign. That's something you don't want to do. And a good rule of thumb is if you're doing a lot of cutting all day long, is that every time you fill up the tank with gas, run a file over the cutters. Now, I'm not saying spend a half hour to an hour doing that. Just spend like 2 or 3 strokes. If you're doing it by hand over each cutter, it'll make a huge difference in how well the saw cuts throughout the day. And if you're cutting hardwoods, things like elm or maple or oak, some of the harder woods out there, you may need to do it every time you fill up. But if you're cutting some softer woods, conifers or aspen or something, or white birch, maybe every other time you may need to run the file over it. So those are your handy tips of the week. What's your experience, Cody? Similar to that, or do you have any other hints?
Yeah, I kept thinking of things and you kept mentioning them. So I think you did a pretty good job there. If you're new to working with saws and sharpening them, there's a number of different things out there that can help you make sure you're hitting the right angles. Like little gauges you can strap onto your file to make sure you're hitting the right angle for your saw. And definitely file more frequently rather than less frequently. It's a lot easier to keep that chain tuned up with a good filing every so often than to have to really grind away with your file if you start dinging that chain up pretty good.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, let's move on to some more questions that we got in via email. So first question is, do I really need to contract with all of the folks I work with, the logger, the forester? And my suggestion is that yes, it's a good idea to get a contract with all those folks. For one thing, it protects you. And the other thing is that it identifies who's responsible for what. It shows that it indicates who's going to do what kind of work, when they're going to do it, how you're going to get paid, especially if it's a commercial timber sale. So, I know it may be a big deal and you'd rather just have a handshake agreement, but protect yourself and your property. This might only happen once or twice in the whole time you own the property. So take the precautions, get a contract, and you'll be better off in the long run. Anything to add, Cody?
Yeah, that was a great answer, Bill. You don't need to have those things, but I mean, it's all about protecting yourself, really. I wish more people had the contracts they needed when they're working with these professionals. You know, I've worked with a number of landowners that felt burned after timber harvest because you know, the guys said they'd come back and clean things up and they never did. You know, if you have that in the contract, you can kind of hold that to them a little more.
Okay, here's another question. How do I resolve a property line dispute with a neighbor? And The thing is with the lands here in Wisconsin, many of them have never been surveyed. All that is a description of where your property is. It might be described as the southwest corner of the southwest corner of the southwest corner of section 1 in township range, whatever, in this county. And so there, you might not even know, there might not be any corners that have been set, no lines have been drawn or surveyed out. And so that might be the only thing you have to go on as to where your property is and where the lines might be. And that's not uncommon. And so often you have to just work with your neighbors to identify where those corners are and be clear with each other where those lines and corners are. Sometimes it gets contentious and you may need to get a surveyor in. If you can work together with your neighbor, that's the best. Maybe share the cost of a surveyor. And if it's really contentious, you might need to pay for it yourself. And sometimes these go to the courts to try to figure out. So I encourage you not to get to that point. Work with your neighbor and try to figure it out as best you can. Make some compromises if possible. But it's never easy, especially if it's very unclear as to where the line is. What's been your experience with property lines, Cody?
Yeah, I mean, you always want to try and sort it out at the lowest possible level. I mean, you hate to have to come to a contentious situation, but a survey is probably the best thing to do in that case. In southern Wisconsin, with all the grazing history, there's fences running everywhere in the woods. You know, the sayings, good fences make good neighbors, but sometimes that fence isn't accurate. I've run into a lot of pretty far off the line fences, you know, over a chain off the actual line before. So always work with your neighbors and, you know, do your best job you can. But if you need to get a survey, that might be the best bet too.
Okay. We're this next question is about wildfires. We're kind of in the wildfire season now. I've been hearing a lot about wildfires and I'm wondering how worried I should be. Well, it kind of depends. And there's some parts of the state where the soil is very sandy and the species on there tend to be well adapted to wildfires. And so if you're living in land on property that, or in parts of the state where it's very sandy like that, or has a lot of sand, then it's something that you should really be conscious of and take steps to protect your property and your buildings that are on it. So I think a good first step is to figure out, are you in a fire prone area? And then if you think you are, talk to someone like Cody about what kind of steps you should take. Is that a fair train of thought to take on this, Cody?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd use the adjective worried about it, but if you recognize that you're in a fire-prone landscape, you know, where the issues happen is what we call the wildland urban interface, where we have houses, you know, very close up to areas that are susceptible to wildfires. So looking at the sandy pine areas you talked about, or even areas with lots of grassland. And, you know, Wisconsin doesn't have the big conflagrations like you see out west. But if you look at our number one cause of wildfires, it's debris burning. And a lot of times it comes from those incinerators. And how close is that incinerator to your property? I mean, it doesn't take a huge fire to start, you know, causing some risk and threatening some structures. So if you recognize that this is a concern for you, the best thing you can do is just be prepared. If you go to dnr.wi.gov, I think you can find some FireWise resources, and FireWise is just some steps you can take to prepare your house and your landscaping in the event of wildfire and make it more tenable if that situation should happen.
Yeah, I've had a lot of luck finding information on a DNR site just by searching for wildfires. It takes you right to the main page and you can check where the fires have been. That's a great one to look at, if nothing else, to see where all the fires have been in this year or this season, the last few days. It's really interesting stuff. Okay, the last question we have is, what is the best wood for firewood? In general, the best wood is the wood that's dry. And I say that jokingly, but it's true. If it's not dry, it's not going to be very good firewood. You could have the best species for burning. It's the densest wood, but if it's not dry, it doesn't matter. And what you're shooting for is about a 20% moisture content in the wood. So that's, well, what does that mean? And you can get a moisture meter to test it. If you're really concerned about it, what the heat content is, you can test it. But actually, if you put stack your wood in the sun, where it's exposed to the sun and the wind, you should get it down in 18 months at the maximum it'll take. Some people can get it done in like 6 months and it's ready to burn after just one season. but it's better to let it dry thoroughly. You can test it by hitting two pieces together. If they make kind of a sharp sound, then it's a good indication that it's probably dry. If they make a dull sound, it's usually that they're still wet. If that got cracks in the end, what's called checking, that's a good sign that it's starting to dry well. Or if it starts to change color, turns to a gray or a yellow, that's also a good sign that it's starting to dry. You burn firewood, Cody?
I used to. I had a wood burning stove that I used to heat most of my house. The last place I lived in, I heated my home exclusively with dead elm and dead oak trees.
Oh, that's good wood. Not fun to split, but it's the elm especially. I mean, the elm is not fun to split.
No, you want a hydraulic splitter for that elm.
The oak is
nice, so you can.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the oak is a joy to split. It just kind of falls apart. Elm is just the opposite.
It's nice to use it too because the elm will start burning really quickly, and so you can get a fire going. Then you can put the oak on there for the heat to use it puts out.
Yeah, and hickory, which is our tree of the week, let me share that with you, is another great firewood species. There we go. And so shagbark hickory in particular, the scientific name is Caria ovata. It's a very high heat value, so it's great for firewood. You can the picture on the left, you can see the bark kind of splits off in narrow and vertical strips like that. Hence, it's kind of looks shaggy. Hence the name shagbark hickory. The middle picture is one leaf, and those are each leaflets on the leaf. And shagbark hickory produces these wonderful big fruits that wildlife love and we love. The wood, as I said, is good for firewood, but it's also very dense. It makes great tool handles, axe handles, other tool handles, and many people use it for smoking meat. It adds a great flavor to your meats when you smoke them with hickory. Now you've got a lot down where you are, right? Big component of the woods there.
Oh yeah, we got a lot of hickory down here, all right, especially shagbark. Bitternut too. Down here, we tend to manage more for shagbark when we can. I like shagbark when I'm teaching landowners tree ID. This is one of the first ones I go to start building confidence because it's easy and there's just nothing else out in the woods that looks like it.
Okay, so that's our program for tonight. Next Tuesday, May 12th, we will be talking about Snapshot, Wisconsin. And it'll be at 4:30 p.m. So thanks, Cody. It was great working with you. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks.